Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me on the podcast industry stage. So today, with any luck, we're going to talk about podcast advertising metrics and how they've evolved over time. So these aren't your grandmother's podcast advertising metrics anymore. I am Cameron. I'm one of the co-founders at Magellan AI. I'm half software engineer, half salesperson, but today we're going to talk about focus on metrics that we've measured from hundreds of campaigns and some of the lessons we've taken from that. Picking up the theme of AI, the question is, I always like to start with contextualizing what is the AI in Magellan AI, where do we get some of our data from so you know what you're looking at. So our AI scans podcast episodes, a rather tame use of AI compared to some of the examples we just heard about that were pretty exciting. We identify ad placements. We look at things like host-read versus produced spots, dynamic insertion versus embedded, and we use all of that to basically crunch the data and tell you about ad intelligence, verification, measurement. We look at things like, is the campaign meeting an advertiser's expectations with pixel-based attribution? Is a campaign reaching the audience that it was intended to with audience measurement? And then things like spend analysis to understand, are advertisers buying direct? Are they buying programmatically? So all of that is kind of feeding into the data we're going to take a look at today. To kick things off, I thought it might be useful to think about the kinds of people that are approaching podcast advertising, the perspectives that they come with. So every marketer knows how to target and measure campaigns on search and social and tools like Facebook and Instagram and Google. What they often don't realize when we talk to them is that marketers can apply similar technologies to podcasts, in some cases in 2025 for the first time, which is really exciting. So let's think about what are some of the drivers behind that. And to do that, I'm going to put us all in a time machine. We're going to go back a year, because I know this is exactly what we would do. We would go back to the beginning of 2024, and the cookie apocalypse was a hot talking point. Cookies were going to go away. Google Chrome was going to phase them out. Obviously, the cookie apocalypse did not quite come to pass the way people thought it might originally. But it did force marketers to start thinking about different ways to measure. And one of the things that it benefited was podcast advertising. Because, oddly enough, podcasts never had the benefit of cookies in the first place. Podcasts are just different. You've got the ad exposure, the podcast listening experience takes place on a device that's different from the device where the conversion may take place. And in some cases, the conversion may take place days or weeks or months later. So because podcasts never had the benefit of cookies, we didn't really have the problem of cookies going away. And as advertisers are starting to look at metrics besides cookies to understand performance across different channels, they're starting to see more consistency between the way podcast advertising is measured and the way other channel advertising is measured. So thinking a little bit about conversion level attribution in podcast advertising, it works, it just is a little bit different. So I thought I'd highlight some of the lessons from our podcast advertising campaigns that we've measured. Number one, communication is key in the podcast advertising channel. Particularly when it comes to measurement. We really love, our partners, like SiriusXM Media, our partners like iHeartMedia, who are, professionals. They understand, podcast advertising and attribution. There are so many podcast creators, though, that are completely new to the concept, and inevitably, podcasters are wanting to understand, how everything works from the perspective of, making sure that they're delivering the best experience, for their audiences. So what we found is that it's really helpful to, educate podcasters, especially the individual creators, on how all this technology works, create resources around that. And that's the big difference between, measuring a campaign that only has, a handful of podcasts on it, actively plugged in and measured, versus measuring an entire podcast advertising campaign for an advertiser. One of the second things we've learned, the devil's in the details of, especially when you're comparing against promo code redemptions. So when we think about, the different tools that podcast advertisers had prior to pixel-based attribution, a lot of them are using things like promo codes, surveys, vanity URLs. These things are really helpful for understanding not just podcast advertising, but the impact of multiple channels across the podcast advertising ecosystem. And so one of the things that we've had to do with almost every campaign we've measured is sit alongside the advertiser, look at the data from promo code redemptions, and understand why is that telling a slightly different story than what pixel-based attribution is telling. So in one campaign, for example, we found 33% lift on certain show metrics when we were looking at pixel-based attribution, whereas promo codes were telling a different story. And the underlying reason for that was because promo codes were popping up, generic promo codes were popping up when visitors were landing on vanity URLs. So it was ambiguating the picture for the advertiser in terms of what was actually driving performance. But when we got into the weeds and we understood, what the differences were, it really gave them confidence that pixel-based attribution was the right tool for them to be using. The third piece, audio's funnel, just looks a little bit different. So everyone is a little bit, when they come into the podcast channel, they're often coming from the perspective of, immediate gratification with display and social. It's a great thing when it happens, but it doesn't always happen for podcast advertising immediately. It takes, that's why we have something called a look-back window. So it's a little bit different where you look at conversions over a 1-day, 7-day, 14-day, or 30-day, or in some cases even longer conversion period. It's a different set of expectations entering a campaign when you're thinking about measurement. So that's conversion level attribution. It's not just about attribution though, and I think really interesting to hear about some of the AI targeting tools in our prior lightning talk here. One of the things that we've observed is that advertisers are taking more advantage of programmatic technologies, including audience targeting. Podcasts, of course, have been known for host-read ads, organic, hosts talking about products in organic ways, and that happens still a ton. But last quarter, so in Q4, we picked up about 1,600 advertisers running podcast ad campaigns programmatically. So how did we identify programmatic ad campaigns? You might wonder. We look at ad creative and we see when it runs across multiple podcasts, across multiple networks. We can kind of take a guess when we see that podcast ad creative runs across a hosting platform like Megaphone, and it only appears there, which is Spotify's hosting platform. We infer that it may be a Spotify audience network kind of buy. And so when you have, taking a step back, about 1,598 out of 8,500 or so, campaigns or advertisers that we picked up in Q4 were running programmatic campaigns. So that's 1 out of every 6. And the trend is actually to the up and to the right. So the early look at Q1 data is it's closer to about 1 out of every 5 podcast advertisers is accessing the podcast market programmatically. That doesn't mean that's the only way they're accessing it. That just means that's one of the tools in the toolbox. It's a relatively new tool in the toolbox and one of the things that we're excited about. And it works. So we see that, Magellan AI, we were able to independently validate the effectiveness for a Fortune 50 brand, looking to reach B2B decision makers. So in this particular niche audience, we were able to compare this advertiser's hashed email addresses with the audience that they were reaching and validate that it was the right audience. And then it's not just about programmatic. Show-specific buying is getting better as well. So we have more audience insights available than ever. These are just some illustrative examples of being able to look at podcasts that have do-it-yourselfer audiences, go beyond contextual targeting, look at things like podcasts with millennial audiences, and then my personal favorite is identifying podcasts for cat enthusiasts. The future is bright, lots of opportunity as AI and data and measurement continues to expand in podcast advertising. So thank you for joining me, and looking forward to the rest of the talks.